Good evening. Welcome to my talk. History is important. Brief overview of the history of CSS. In general, I would say history is important. We can learn a lot from history. It helps us to understand why things are the way they are today. And many challenges we face are not entirely new. We can see how they were solved before and then decide if it was good or not, the way it was done. But the question for today is what can we learn from the history of CSS? So let me start with something that happened about 984 hours ago, because in his talk at the first CSS meetup, our dear colleague Manuel said something about his first footsteps with HTML and CSS, and he showed us some early examples he used. And at some point, he said something about CSS 30 years ago. And at this moment, so I can't really remember what he said after that, because my brain just stuck. I had kind of a mental blue screen of death saying there was no CSS 30 years ago. Luckily, my brain rebooted quickly and I could follow along the rest of his talk, which was very interesting, and I enjoyed it. Well, I can't really blame my brain for acting like that, because as a front-end developer, I've been training it to spot like very little errors, like a missing semicolon or something like that. And especially in my case, I'm also a trained informatics teacher, so whenever there pop up errors, I can't look over them. So this was kind of the idea for talking about the history of CSS, and I made a little research about it. I guess many of you think, or many people think that HTML and CSS, they are like twins. They were like born together and raised together, and they developed in slightly different directions, but still they share a lot. They have different hobbies and different friends, but still they are connected. But actually it's more like, they are more like a couple. So HTML is slightly older, and at some point they found each other and they live happily together since then. But what's also interesting is that there were other technologies who wanted to be in a relationship with HTML. And I will talk about some of them a little bit later, but let's start with the beginning. And the beginning is the World Wide Web and HTML. It was created by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, so 31 years ago. And this is what the first website looks like in a modern browser. And Tim Berners-Lee, who worked at the CERN, he's a scientist, and he was interested in scientific solutions. And scientists, they're mostly interested in content. They don't care so much about the way it is presented. And so Tim Berners-Lee, he didn't have any presentational elements or functions in mind when he created HTML. It was more about the collaboration between scientists. So back then at the CERN, there were already some 1,000 scientists, not all in Geneva, but spread across the world. And even a simple application where you had the contact information of your colleagues was like something very helpful. This is the first website, and I guess for this purpose it worked fine. The first browser which was available for all platforms was the Line Mode browser, and the website we saw before in the Line Mode browser looked something like this. And then it becomes clear that the way something is presented has limits with this technology. This was actually, so the Limeware browser was written by Nicola Bello. She was an intern at the CERN and worked together with Tim Berners-Lee in 1990. And yeah, then new browsers came, and web developers and web designers, they weren't happy with the functions of HTML and how browsers showed the web. There was an urgent need to have like font with shadows. The website wouldn't make sense otherwise. I mean, if you don't have it. So they started to use hacks. And as we heard in Manuel's talk, it isn't really a good idea for accessibility to have text in images. I'm not really sure how I know about this website. Maybe Manuel or Max tweeted it, I'm not sure. So it's a restaurant at the Old Danube, and it's their current website. And if you look at the menu plan, they have the current menus. So they use this website today with this design. I think that's fantastic. But it's more the nostalgic part of me than the accessibility part. Yeah, so there were ideas about how to add presentational features to HTML, and one of the first technologies who tried to do this were implemented in the Viola W3 browser. It was programmed by Pei-Yuan Wei, and it was the first popular graphical browser. And so the font, the style sheet language was implemented in the browser. It was part of the browser, and it looks like this. So you have nesting, and also the way the attributes are named. I think it's quite similar to what we know about CSS today. And this was in 1993. Another technology was called RRP. It had a very short syntax, and the idea was that the connection speed was so slow back then that like every character counted. And what you see here, FA equals HE means the font family should be Helvetica, and the font size should be 18. And there aren't any units, so the context makes clear what unit it should be. So for the font size, it would be point. And it was more seen as a recommendation to the browser, so that there was still the line mode browsers. It wasn't meant to be like, it has to be like this, but it could or should be like that. Another big step was the presentation of HTML tags implemented in Netscape Navigator.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
For the previous slide, where was that written? Was it a file on its own, or was it part of the HTML file? Because that doesn't look like any syntax of that file.
This link tag we use today was already used before, but I'm not sure if it was Viola or RRP. I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
Interesting.
I couldn't try it out. This isn't available. Yeah, the present HTML text. So it was Mark Andreessen who built the Netscape Navigator, and he had the idea to add tags. And Manuel already talked about it. So you have font size 3, and 3 is the default value, and possible values are between 1 and 7. And what I didn't know is that you also can use relative values. So you can use +2 or -3. That's very interesting. It also became part of the HTML spec in HTML 3.2, so 1997, but it already became deprecated in 4.01, 2 years later. So many browsers implemented this, and it was used widely, I would say. something very interesting I didn't know before is something called document style semantics and specification language, which is abbreviated by DSSSL. And it was a proper programming language. So what you see here is like a very easy approach to it, but you can also create functions with mathematical constructs, and you had the inherit value, and you had like simple variables. It was really powerful. Björn said it was, at some point, it was more or less clear that this would be the technology for presentational functions. But I read that it didn't work out because with this, it was able to style the parent. So I think some feature we all want to have at some point is that you have a parent selector, and the reason why there isn't one is that in the early times it was seen as crucial that you could display a website even though not all the contents were loaded. And if you would have a parent selector, it could change the way the website looks when the rest of the content is loaded. Okay, yeah, but now finally move on to CSS. It was proposed by Oliver Spies in 1994, and what was new and special about his technology is that you could use multiple style sheets and you could overwrite styles. In an early draft, it was a negotiation between the browser and the user. So at this point, people were like having discussions about who's the one to decide how a website looks. Is it the user with his individual settings, or is it the web developer or the web designer? It wasn't really clear back then how it should be. And that's why we have here this 30% value. So you could set, in this case, a font size and set a value and say how important it is for you that this is the value. So it would be a negotiation between the browser and the user style sheet. And I'm not completely sure how it worked, if it was like the higher value won, because I also read that it would calculate an average from these values. So, yeah, very interesting, but that's not how we know CSS today. And that's because in a later step, Oliver worked together with Boss, and they simplified it, and they came up with the syntax the way we know it today. And it was already in 1996 when it came out. But it wasn't really, in the beginning it already had classes and ID selectors, it had pseudo classes and pseudo elements. I didn't know that there was a first line pseudo element. I tried it out, it works. And already in the beginning there was the important rule. I guess they learned from
just 0 and 100%.
These are the properties which were available already in CSS1. So quite a lot, and I don't know how many % of the CSS I usually write are already covered with CSS1. But yeah, CSS1 wasn't really usable before 1997, and it wasn't implemented in browsers before Netscape Navigator 4 and IE 4. And even the early implementations were full of bugs, and browsers read it differently. The first browser who had full CSS support, so it looked the way it should and it followed the specification, was IE5 for Mac. And still it wasn't standard compliant in many browsers for years. They came up with a a test. It was called ACID2 test, and the browser vendors could see how well they followed the specification. Maybe some of you still remember this. Yeah, then the next step was CSS2. Then we got position and set index and media types, so we could have print style sheets, and also for audio. There were new selectors, new pseudo classes and pseudo elements, the content, text shadow, and cursor. This was implemented in CSS2. And the interesting thing is, CSS2 was a recommendation in 1998, and CSS 2.1 the first time 2004, and then it went on between being a recommendation and a working draft between 2004 and 2011. So between those years, it was still fuzzy, I would say. Yeah, and then we are with CSS 3 already, which came out in 2011. And the big thing which changed with CSS 3 is that now there isn't one big specification, but everything is in modules. So you can't, there won't be CSS 4. There will be a CSS 3 background, mod level 4, so that the modules, they have levels and they develop further, but there isn't one big specification as we know it before. Yeah, they can use, again, use selectors and subclasses, concepts, cover and contain, yeah, lots of interesting and helpful things. And media queries, I guess, very important for our work today are the media queries. Yeah, I already said that. Text box and grid. Yeah, and then the question is, what can we learn from the history of CSS? And I would say not too much. I think the history of CSS isn't important at all for what we do today. I just think it's interesting. And when I prepared this talk, I needed to come up with a title, and I wanted to use the important rule in the title. And I couldn't think of any other occasion to talk about this, and people would be willing to listen to it than here. So yeah, I'm even faster than I thought. I won't fill the 20 minutes. I'm sorry. And yeah, I hope you won't regret coming in. If you spotted anything historically incorrect, I would be happy to hear a talk about it and say it clear. But I can't be here next time, so maybe meet at number 4. Yeah, there are some sources. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering if you look back on the history of CSS and compare it with the state of the language now, do you feel like it has taken a wrong turn somewhere? Like, were there features in the past that you would like to see now, or do you think it has just improved overall?
I can't say it took a wrong turn because I don't know what other directions there were available.
Sure.
Well, when at the conference, when Rachel Andrew talked about new grid stuff and things, I had the impression that things get much more complicated nowadays. And CSS was or is successful and was chosen to be the language because it is simple. It's simple to learn and simple to read. It was simple to render for the browsers. So this DSSL, it was like really complicated, and yeah, they thought browser vendors wouldn't be able to implement it. I think it's good that we have new features. I listened to an interview with Håkan Willier, and he said he was against border radius for a really long time. He thought this wouldn't be something practical, and still it is useful, and yeah, there are new features.
Before we had border radius, we had to slice it with images.
Yeah.
So, thank you. What's your favorite property in CSS? Great question, I know.
Yeah, it's really hard.
And Oliver, what's your favorite color in CSS?
Just to make it clear, from now on, every speaker has.
Yeah. It's an introduction, maybe. Like,
Yeah.
say your name.
My name is my favorite color is.
Yeah. So I think my favorite color is midnight blue. The property. I can't tell right now.
You all know the story of Rebecca Purple. There's a color called Rebecca Purple, and it has a very heartbreaking story behind it, and I recommend you do your homework.
You already said that last time, so yeah, just tell us.
Alright. Not yet.
Maybe the third edition.
Maybe next time.
I will tell anyone who wants to know in the break.
If you could bring a property back that was discontinued, any idea?
I don't know many, or I can't think of any which is discontinued.
I mean, at least it's sort of like it's not implemented anymore. It just doesn't do anything. That's not really discontinuation.
Yeah, in terms of HTML, there's stuff that was never really in the standard, like Netscape had layers, which wanted to animate things with the DHTML. You have to use layers. That kind of disappeared. But I don't know the back.
And I don't remember my first steps with HTML and CSS too good, so I couldn't do a presentation like Manuel, which like, this was my first website. I have a slight idea, but I'm sure it isn't. I can't find it anywhere, and my memory isn't too good either. So.
Did you have a look at JSSS?
No. Well, I came across, but I didn't like it, and I skipped it.
Because Netscape briefly implemented their own standard for JavaScript style sheets. So,
So, what's your favorite CSS in JS library?
I guess that's your question, but
I'm a big fan of style components, like most of them. And I mean, at the same time, these days, basically the implementation and especially the API surface is sort of converging into one. So emotion and style components is basically indistinguishable if you just read the code. So it's very much about what we want when it comes to forms and everything. And it sort of makes sense, just sort of agree on how people should write stuff. Well, in that sense, people agree on how people should write stuff. And the library then just deals with the implementation of it. What's yours?
I mean, I use both, but I'm a little forward looking, so I think my deck will be something like Binaria, which implements roughly the same API, but instead you don't have runtime. So you sort of get the ergonomics of CSS.js without the cost, because it combines CSS and CSS variables, which means it's not going to work on literally x46, but the work on that is not.
How's it called?
Binaria. There's another one called Afterburn. Afterburn from Binaria. At least for me, those are the main things.
Right. Any other questions? In that case, thank you very much.